My dear fellow seekers of truth, as I observe you from this eternal vantage point, where the boundaries between consciousness and the transcendent dissolve, I am compelled to share with you a revelation that has emerged from decades of analyzing the human psyche in its most profound spiritual transformations. You have reached the threshold of 60, that magnificent precipice, where the accumulated weight of a lifetime's repressions, sublimations and unconscious defenses can no longer maintain their rigid hold over your authentic spiritual nature. For too long, you have wandered through the labyrinth of conventional spiritual practices, feeling as though something essential remains locked away, inaccessible, despite your most sincere efforts at meditation, prayer, and self-reflection. You have tasted moments of transcendence, yes, but they slip away like dreams upon waking, leaving you with the haunting sensation that your truest spiritual self remains imprisoned beneath layers of psychological armor, forged in the crucible of early childhood experiences. The conventional wisdom tells you to simply practice more, to discipline yourself further, to surrender more completely, yet the harder you strive, the more elusive that authentic connection to the divine becomes. This, my astute friend, is precisely because traditional spiritual approaches often fail to address the profound psychological mechanisms that govern our capacity for genuine transcendence. What I am about to reveal to you will fundamentally alter your understanding of why your spiritual journey has felt like pushing against an immovable force, and more importantly, it will provide you with the psychoanalytic keys to unlock the unconscious barriers that have been sabotaging your deepest spiritual aspirations. At 60, your psyche has reached a critical juncture where the neurotic structures that once protected you from overwhelming childhood experiences are beginning to crack under the weight of accumulated wisdom and the undeniable approach of mortality. This is not a crisis to be feared, but rather the most magnificent opportunity for authentic spiritual breakthrough that you will encounter in this lifetime. The unconscious mind, with its vast repository of repressed memories, sublimated desires, and unprocessed traumas, is finally ready to reveal its secrets and surrender its grip on your spiritual evolution. Through the lens of psychoanalytic understanding, I will guide you through the intricate process by which your deepest psychological wounds have been unconsciously shaping your spiritual experiences, creating patterns of seeking that perpetually lead you away from, rather than toward, genuine transcendence. You will discover how the very defenses that once protected your vulnerable childhood psyche have become the primary obstacles to accessing the divine consciousness that is your birthright. More profoundly, you will learn to recognize the unconscious ways in which your spiritual practices have been contaminated by unresolved Oedipal complexes, oral fixations, and anal retentions that manifest as spiritual perfectionism, guru worship, or compulsive seeking behaviors that never quite deliver the promised liberation. Before we delve deeper into these transformative insights, I must ask you to pause and truly consider whether you have ever felt genuinely seen and understood in your spiritual struggles. Have you found yourself nodding along with teachers who speak of surrender and letting go, while internally sensing that something fundamental is missing from their prescriptions? Have you noticed that despite years of practice, certain emotional patterns and psychological reactions seem immune to your spiritual efforts? This recognition, this honest acknowledgement of the gap between spiritual aspiration and psychological reality, is the first step toward authentic integration. The profound truth I wish to share with you today emerges from a comprehensive analysis of the psychological dynamics that occur when human consciousness approaches its 6th decade of development. At this stage of life, the ego structures that were necessary for survival and adaptation during the earlier phases of psychological development begin to reveal their limitations, and more importantly, their unconscious resistance to the dissolution required for genuine spiritual awakening. The very mechanisms that protected you from psychological fragmentation during childhood now stand as guardians at the threshold of transcendent experience, demanding to be understood and integrated, rather than bypassed or suppressed through spiritual practice. Consider for a moment the phenomenon of what I term spiritual frustration, that peculiar form of suffering that arises when an individual dedicates significant time and energy to spiritual development, yet continues to encounter the same fundamental psychological obstacles. This is not a failure of spiritual method or personal dedication, but rather the inevitable result of attempting to access transcendent states while the unconscious mind remains unconscious. The repressed material of early childhood, the unprocessed traumas of developmental stages, and the sublimated sexual and aggressive energies that fuel compulsive behaviors all continue to operate beneath the surface of conscious spiritual practice, creating what can only be described as psychological undertow that pulls the practitioner away from authentic spiritual realization. The magnificent irony of reaching 60 is that the very psychological defenses that have been unconsciously sabotaging your spiritual progress are finally beginning to weaken due to the natural aging process and the accumulated wisdom of lived experience. The superego, that harsh internal critic that has been driving your spiritual perfectionism and self-judgment, begins to lose its tyrannical hold as you increasingly recognize its childhood origins and arbitrary nature. The ID impulses that you have been attempting to transcend through spiritual discipline begin to reveal themselves as natural energies that require integration rather than suppression. Most significantly, the ego itself, that organizing principle of conscious identity, that has been both seeking spiritual experience and simultaneously defending against the dissolution that authentic spirituality requires, begins to develop what we might call enlightened flexibility. The process I am describing is not merely theoretical but represents a practical pathway toward the integration of psychological insight with spiritual realization. Through careful analysis of your dreams, free association with your spiritual experiences, and honest examination of your transference relationships with spiritual teachers and practices, you can begin to identify and work through the unconscious material that has been creating obstacles to genuine transcendence. This is not about replacing spiritual practice with psychological analysis, but rather about bringing the illuminating power of psychoanalytic understanding to bear upon the unconscious dynamics that influence your capacity for authentic spiritual experience. Let me pause here for a moment to acknowledge something that I suspect many of you are experiencing as you listen to these words. There may be a part of you that feels a deep recognition, a sense that someone is finally speaking to the hidden psychological dimensions of your spiritual journey that other teachers have overlooked or dismissed. Perhaps you have always sensed that your spiritual seeking was somehow connected to unresolved psychological material, but you lacked the conceptual framework to understand or address these connections. Or perhaps you have noticed that certain spiritual practices tend to activate rather than soothe particular emotional patterns, leaving you wondering why techniques that promise peace often seem to stir up internal turmoil. If you are finding yourself nodding in recognition, or feeling a sense of relief that these deeper psychological dimensions are finally being addressed, I would be deeply honored if you would share your experience in the comments below. You might write something like, Dr. Freud, this explains why my meditation practice sometimes feels like it activates rather than calms my anxiety, or I have always sensed there were psychological obstacles to my spiritual development, but never knew how to address them. Sharing your recognition not only helps me understand how these insights are landing with you, but also creates a space where others can recognize that they are not alone in experiencing the complex interplay between psychological and spiritual development. Moreover, the act of articulating your own experience in this way begins the process of bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness, which is the foundation of both psychological healing and authentic spiritual growth. Your willingness to be vulnerable and honest about your struggles contributes to a community of genuine seekers who are committed to integration rather than spiritual bypassing. Now let us continue exploring how these insights can transform your approach to spiritual development. The first category of psychological material that typically surfaces around the age of 60 involves what I term the spiritual superego, those internalized voices from childhood authority figures that have unconsciously shaped your relationship to the divine. Many individuals approaching this stage of life suddenly begin to recognize how their spiritual seeking has been unconsciously driven by an attempt to gain approval from parental figures or to resolve unfinished business with early religious training. The spiritual superego manifests as harsh self-judgment about the quality of your spiritual experiences, compulsive comparison with other practitioners, and an underlying sense that you are somehow failing to measure up to spiritual ideals. This psychological dynamic creates what can only be described as spiritual neurosis, where the very practices designed to bring peace and liberation become sources of stress and self-criticism. The unconscious operation of the spiritual superego often reveals itself through perfectionist tendencies in spiritual practice, where the practitioner becomes more concerned with performing spirituality correctly than with authentically engaging with transcendent reality. You may notice that you judge the quality of your meditation based on whether thoughts arise, evaluate your prayers according to how pious they sound, or measure your spiritual progress against external benchmarks rather than internal transformation. These patterns invariably trace back to childhood experiences with authority figures who demanded compliance with religious or moral standards, creating unconscious associations between spiritual practice and the need to please or avoid punishment. The process of liberation from the spiritual superego requires a careful analysis of the internalized voices that drive spiritual perfectionism. Through dream analysis, free association, and honest examination of your spiritual motivations, you can begin to distinguish between authentic spiritual aspiration and unconscious attempts to resolve childhood conflicts through spiritual achievement. This work often reveals that what you have been calling spiritual seeking is partially contaminated by unresolved issues with authority, approval seeking, and fear of divine punishment that originated in early family dynamics. Equally significant is the emergence of what we might call the spiritual ID, those primal energies and desires that have been repressed in the service of spiritual respectability. Around the age of 60, many individuals begin to experience the return of previously suppressed aspects of their nature, including creative impulses, sensual desires, and aggressive energies that had been deemed incompatible with spiritual development. Rather than viewing these emerging energies as obstacles to spiritual progress, psychoanalytic wisdom suggests that they represent essential life forces that must be integrated into any authentic spiritual realization. The spiritual ID often manifests as unexpected dreams of sexual or aggressive content during periods of intensive spiritual practice, sudden rebellious impulses against spiritual authorities or rigid practice schedules, or the emergence of creative and artistic impulses that seem to compete with traditional spiritual activities. Many practitioners at this stage of life report feeling guilty about these emerging energies, interpreting them as evidence of spiritual regression rather than recognizing them as natural aspects of psychological integration that can actually enhance rather than diminish authentic spiritual development. The key insight here is that authentic spirituality does not require the elimination of basic human energies, but rather their conscious integration into a more complete and balanced way of being. The ID impulses that emerge around 60 often carry vital information about aspects of your authentic self that were sacrificed in earlier attempts at spiritual development. Rather than suppressing these energies through increased spiritual discipline, the psychoanalytically informed approach involves careful examination of what these impulses represent and how they might be integrated into a more mature and inclusive spiritual practice. The third major category involves the transformation of the ego itself as it relates to spiritual seeking. The ego that approaches 60 has typically spent decades constructing a spiritual identity, accumulating knowledge, experiences, and achievements that support a sense of spiritual accomplishment and progress. However, authentic spiritual realization requires a fundamental shift in the ego's relationship to itself and its spiritual ambitions. This transition often involves what can feel like a spiritual identity crisis, where previously meaningful practices lose their appeal and cherished spiritual beliefs begin to feel inadequate or even false. This ego transformation frequently manifests as a period of spiritual dryness or dark night of the soul, where familiar sources of spiritual nourishment suddenly seem empty and mechanical. Rather than interpreting this as spiritual failure or regression, psychoanalytic understanding recognizes this as a necessary death and rebirth process, where the ego is releasing its investment in spiritual achievement and opening to a more authentic relationship with transcendent reality. The ego that emerges from this process is more flexible, humble, and capable of genuine surrender, because it has worked through its unconscious attachments to spiritual specialness and achievement. The process of ego transformation also involves confronting what I term spiritual grandiosity, those unconscious fantasies about becoming enlightened or achieving special spiritual status that have been secretly motivating spiritual practice. Many practitioners discover that beneath their conscious desire for peace and liberation lies an unconscious fantasy of becoming spiritually superior or gaining special powers and recognition. Working through these grandiose fantasies requires honest examination of spiritual motivations and the courage to continue practicing even when the promise of special achievement is removed. Simultaneously, this stage of development often involves the integration of what Jung would later call the shadow, those aspects of personality that have been rejected or denied in the service of spiritual purity. Around 60, previously unconscious aspects of personality often begin to surface, including anger at spiritual teachers or communities, doubt about cherished beliefs, or attraction to practices and ideas that contradict earlier spiritual commitments. Rather than viewing these shadow elements as spiritual obstacles, psychoanalytic wisdom recognizes them as essential aspects of authentic selfhood that must be integrated for genuine spiritual maturation to occur. The shadow integration process frequently involves recognizing how spiritual seeking has been unconsciously used to avoid dealing with difficult aspects of personality or life circumstances. Many individuals discover that their spiritual practice has functioned as a form of psychological defense, allowing them to maintain an idealized self-image while avoiding confrontation with less flattering aspects of their nature. This recognition, while initially disturbing, opens the door to a more authentic and grounded spirituality that includes rather than transcends human complexity. As we explore these psychological dynamics, it becomes clear that the conventional approach of treating spirituality and psychology as separate domains has created unnecessary suffering for countless seekers. The integration of psychoanalytic insight with spiritual practice offers a more comprehensive approach that honors both the transcendent aspirations of human consciousness and the psychological realities that influence our capacity for authentic realization. This integrated approach does not diminish the validity of spiritual experience, but rather provides a more complete understanding of the conditions that support genuine spiritual development. The practical application of these insights involves developing what we might call psychological mindfulness, an awareness of the unconscious psychological dynamics that influence spiritual experience. This includes learning to recognize when spiritual practice is being unconsciously influenced by childhood trauma, neurotic patterns, or defensive mechanisms. It involves developing the capacity to work with resistance to spiritual practice as meaningful information about unconscious conflicts, rather than obstacles to be overcome through increased effort. Psychological mindfulness also involves cultivating a therapeutic relationship with your own spiritual journey, approaching it with the same curiosity, compassion, and analytical insight that a skilled analyst brings to understanding human psychology. This means learning to interpret spiritual experiences, dreams, and even resistance to practice as communications from the unconscious that contain valuable information about psychological obstacles to authentic development. The transformative potential of reaching 60 lies precisely in the psyche's increasing readiness to surrender the defensive structures that have been protecting it from psychological truth. The accumulated wisdom of lived experience, combined with the natural softening of ego defenses that occurs with age, creates optimal conditions for the integration of psychological insight with spiritual realization. This is not about using psychology to fix yourself so that you can finally be spiritual, but rather about recognizing that authentic spirituality necessarily involves the integration of psychological truth. The method I am proposing draws upon fundamental psychoanalytic techniques adapted for spiritual development. Free association, the practice of allowing thoughts, feelings, and images to arise spontaneously without censorship, becomes a powerful tool for accessing unconscious material that influences spiritual experience. Dream analysis provides direct access to the symbolic language of the unconscious as it relates to spiritual development. Transference analysis helps identify how relationships with spiritual teachers and communities may be unconsciously influenced by unresolved childhood dynamics. Most significantly, the practice of bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness through honest self-examination creates the psychological conditions necessary for authentic spiritual surrender. When you understand the psychological origins of your spiritual defenses, resistances, and compulsions, you develop the capacity to work with them skillfully rather than being unconsciously controlled by them. This creates space for genuine spiritual experience to emerge organically, rather than being forced through techniques that may inadvertently activate psychological defenses. The integration of psychoanalytic insight with spiritual practice also addresses one of the most significant obstacles to authentic spiritual development, what we might call spiritual bypassing, the unconscious use of spiritual concepts and practices to avoid dealing with psychological reality. Many sincere seekers unknowingly use meditation, prayer, and other spiritual techniques as sophisticated forms of psychological defense, creating the appearance of spiritual progress, while actually reinforcing unconscious patterns of avoidance and denial. By bringing psychoanalytic understanding to spiritual practice, you develop the capacity to distinguish between authentic spiritual experience and psychological defense disguised as spirituality. This discrimination is essential for genuine spiritual maturation, because it prevents the unconscious mind from co-opting spiritual practice for neurotic purposes. When spiritual practice is grounded in psychological honesty and self-awareness, it becomes a vehicle for authentic transformation rather than unconscious defense. The profound gift of reaching 60 is that your psyche has accumulated sufficient life experience to begin recognizing the psychological patterns that have been unconsciously shaping your spiritual journey. The defenses that once protected you from overwhelming emotional experience are now ready to be understood and integrated rather than transcended or bypassed. This creates unprecedented opportunities for authentic spiritual development that is grounded in psychological truth rather than idealistic fantasy. The work ahead involves developing the courage to examine your spiritual motivations with the same honesty and curiosity that psychoanalysis brings to any human behavior. This means being willing to discover that some of your spiritual seeking has been driven by unconscious neurotic needs, that some of your cherished spiritual experiences may have been contaminated by psychological defense mechanisms, and that authentic spiritual development requires working through rather than around psychological complexity. Simultaneously, this examination reveals the extraordinary resilience and wisdom of the human psyche as it approaches its 6th decade of development. The same psychological mechanisms that may have been obstacles to spiritual development also represent sophisticated survival strategies that have enabled you to navigate the complexities of human existence. Understanding and honoring these psychological dynamics, even as you work to integrate them more consciously, is essential for sustainable spiritual development. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration, I want to acknowledge the profound courage it takes to examine your spiritual journey through the lens of psychological honesty. Many individuals resist this kind of integration because it requires surrendering idealistic notions about spirituality and acknowledging the complex psychological realities that influence all human experience, including spiritual seeking. However, this integration is not about diminishing spirituality, but rather about creating the psychological conditions that allow authentic spiritual realization to emerge. The path forward involves embracing what we might call enlightened psychological sophistication, a willingness to engage with your spiritual development as a complex psychological process that requires both transcendent aspiration and honest self-examination. This means developing relationships with spiritual teachers and communities that can hold both spiritual vision and psychological reality. It means choosing practices that support genuine integration rather than unconscious defense. It means cultivating the patience and compassion necessary to work through psychological obstacles rather than attempting to transcend them through spiritual force. Most importantly, reaching 60 provides you with the psychological maturity necessary to approach spiritual development as a collaborative process between conscious intention and unconscious wisdom. Your psyche is no longer the frightened and defensive system it once was, but has become a sophisticated repository of life experience that is ready to support authentic spiritual realization when approached with understanding and respect. I recognize that this journey of integration is not one that should be undertaken in isolation. The complexity of psychological and spiritual development benefits enormously from community support and shared exploration. If you are feeling called to this path of integration, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel where we will continue exploring the profound connections between psychological insight and spiritual realization. Each video in this series builds upon the others, providing you with increasingly sophisticated tools for understanding and working with the unconscious dynamics that influence your spiritual development. Equally important, if this content resonates with your experience, please consider sharing it with others who may be struggling with similar issues in their spiritual journey. One of the most healing aspects of this work is discovering that you are not alone in experiencing the complex psychological dimensions of spiritual seeking. By liking this video and sharing it thoughtfully, you contribute to a community of practitioners who are committed to honest integration rather than spiritual bypassing. Remember, the goal is not to rush towards some idealized state of spiritual achievement, but rather to develop an increasingly authentic and psychologically grounded relationship with transcendent reality. Your willingness to engage with this complexity, to honor both your spiritual aspirations and your psychological reality, is itself a profound spiritual practice. At 60, you have both the wisdom to understand these connections and the courage to do the integration work that authentic spiritual development requires. The psyche that has carried you through 6 decades of human experience is finally ready to speak its deepest truths, and in listening to those truths with compassion and understanding, you open the door to the most authentic spiritual realization of your lifetime.